Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Simon Wright. I am the Director of Programming here at Japan House London. And thank you for joining us at Japan House for tonight's talk on collecting and displaying Japan at the British Museum, a talk by Dr. Rosina Buckland. This event is a part of a series held in collaboration with the Royal Collection Trust. And tonight, in addition to the audience here at Japan House, we are also broadcasting live to a virtual audience on Zoom, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. So also a warm welcome to our viewers online. And this event will be recorded, and a recording will be archived on our online platforms for people to view later. This talk is the second in a series of 4 events held in collaboration with the Royal Collection Trust, exploring how Japanese art and design has been collected and exhibited in the UK. We are delighted to be joined by our speaker this evening, Dr. Rosina Buckland from the British Museum, who will shed light on the museum's Japanese collection dating back to the early 1700s. And after presenting the history of the Japanese collection and some of its excellent examples from paintings and prints through ceramics and metalwork, Dr. Buckland explains how the curatorial team showcases a changing selection of works in the Mitsubishi Corporation Japanese galleries. In relation to the current exhibition at Japan House, The Carpenter's Line, and we're very pleased, thank you very much indeed, the talk ends with a brief explanation of items demonstrating the high level of woodworking skills in Japan as seen in the British Museum's collection. And so before we start, I'll tell you a little bit about Dr. Rosina Buckland, who received a BA degree in Japanese Studies from the University of Cambridge, an MA from SOAS, University of London, and her PhD in art history from the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. Her publications include Shunga, Erotic Art in Japan, and Painting Nature for the Nation, Takikate, and the Challenges of Sinophile Culture in Meiji, Japan. Having worked at the British Museum, the National Museum of Scotland, and the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, in 2020, she returned to the British Museum as curator of the Japanese collections. She recently submitted the manuscript for a textbook on Japanese arts of the Meiji era and is preparing for an exhibition examining the representations and myths of the samurai. Following the presentation, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions from those of you here at Japan House and also for those of you online. So without further ado, will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Rosina Buckland.
Thank you, Simon. Good evening. I'd like to express my thanks to Japan House for inviting me to speak this evening, and particularly to the organisers Simon Wright and his team. I'm delighted to have the chance to introduce to you some of the history behind the remarkable collections at the British Museum. I took up the position of curator in April 2020, as was mentioned, having worked there twice before, so it's been a long relationship. The British Museum has been in existence for 270 years, exactly this year, being the first national public museum of the world. It holds 8 million objects representing the cultural history of humanity. And across more than 90 galleries, visitors can discover the many forms and expressions human beings have given to aspects of life and to understand their interconnections. There's an extensive program of special exhibitions, schools events, tours, lectures, and many other activities. The museum is a shared resource comparable to a library, free to enter, with much on display, but even greater resources in storage, waiting to be utilized by all manner of people. Today, the entire collection is searchable online using the database, accessible via the museum's website. And within this vast assemblage of collections, there is a wealth of objects from Japan. We're often asked where they came from, and this is invariably an interesting story, with each object's journey illuminating some aspect of the history of interaction between Japan and Britain across the centuries, ranging from on-the-ground collecting to distant fascination with its art and culture. The collection has been built up thanks to the efforts of hundreds of individuals. So this evening I'll sketch out some of the story by introducing 10 significant sources, and thereby provide an overview of the scope in terms of materials, media, and time periods. The collection continues to grow, and I'll show some of the more recent acquisitions. And then I'll talk briefly about how we display works from this vast range, including some special exhibitions, upcoming special exhibitions, And given the special exhibition on woodworking across the hall, I'll end by talking about some related works. The story begins in the early 1700s with Sir Hans Sloane, not quite the founder of the museum, but its prime mover. Sloane was a physician trained in London and Paris, and in 1687 he travelled to Jamaica as physician to the governor, the Duke of Albemarle. He used the opportunity to collect 800 plant specimens and artifacts. When he returned the following year, he married an heiress to sugar plantations in Jamaica, the profits from which contributed substantially to his ability to acquire objects in subsequent decades. And during his long life, Sloane amassed an immense and diverse collection, which comprised over 50,000 books and manuscripts, 32,000 coins and medals, scientific instruments, antiquities, and ethnographic artifacts, as well as fossils, shells, corals, and animal parts. And after his death, his collection was bought by an Act of Parliament for £20,000, and then combined with 3 private libraries and his own to establish the British Museum. As you can see, the antiquities played a very small role within that greater whole, taking up just one room on the upper floor of the previous building, Montague House. Sloane had a very significant connection with Japan through the person of Engelbert Kempfer, who was resident in Deshima, the artificial island off Nagasaki. He was resident there 1690 to 1692. And in 1727, Sloane published a translation of Kempfer's book, The History of Japan, which for many decades was the primary first-hand report on the country. Sloane purchased objects that had belonged to Kempfer, such as the incense burner you see here on the screen, which was described as an ink pot. Hope you can just see those words there. Ink at the end of the top line and the pot on the second line. So some misunderstanding. And then other ceramics, lacquer items, including a zushi or household shrine that you see on the right. So these are our earliest works, our earliest arrivals into the collection. After Sloane, it was another 100 years before the Japan collection began to develop, and this was thanks to a man who has been called the second founder of the British Museum. Augustus Wollaston Frank served at the museum for 45 years, from 1851 to 1896. He greatly enriched the museum's holdings through careful acquisition and the donation of his own vast and valuable collection. For Japanese objects originating with Franks in our database, there are 3,832 records across a wide range of media. And of those, the largest portion is ceramics at 1,476 pieces, accounting for about half the total Japanese ceramic holdings. The prevailing taste in Japanese ceramics in Europe had long been highly decorated porcelain, and had been a consuming passion for some aristocrats and royals. Franks initially collected material of this sort, export porcelain of the 17th and 18th centuries, ranging from early Arita and Kakiemon wares, and then right through to 19th century productions, but also works by contemporary potters, which you see some examples of on the screen here. Miyagawa Kozan, top right, Takahashi Dohachi IV and Wake Kite IV in the bottom right. So brand new pieces as well. And the research of the scholar Ai Fukunaga has shed some light on Franks's approach and attitudes. He was one of the earliest collectors to recognize that Japan's porcelain production had been aimed at the foreign market, and Japanese taste tended rather to understated stoneware. He wrote, "However much the Japanese may excel in porcelain, it is in their pottery that they show the most remarkable success." In keeping with his times, Franks was rigorously scientific and comparative in his approach. Yet by foregrounding ceramic tea utensils, he was unusual in taking a more cultural perspective, eschewing the typically aesthetic or technical assessment of foreign products. In his book, Japanese Pottery of 1880, he described the tea clubs and details of the architecture of the tea room, the procedures of the rituals and the objects employed. And his collection included examples, vases, tea bowls, many tea jars, water containers, food dishes, and teapots for the form of steeped tea, known as sencha, and this is distinct from the whisked tea, matcha, which we associate with, or which is the form for the tea ceremony, as it's often called. And then there are other works, ornamental works, figurines, chargers, containers, sake vessels, and more. And you have a selection on the screen here of various wares, glazes, colors, approaches, forms. Frank's collected in a phenomenal number of areas, but one where we particularly continue to benefit from his energy and efforts is Buddhist material. He built up the collection as preparation for the opening of the Gallery of Religions in 1894, encompassing Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam, taking the approach typical of the time of comparative religion. And what these acquisitions possess in quantity, they do not lack in quality, and they have never been surpassed. There are remarkable early sculptures, such as the 14th or 15th century Aizen-myo in wood, the bright red figure there you see, the bronze dated figure of Shakyamuni during fasting, and also a strong core of paintings, one of which I show you there at left. As with tea, Frank's received detailed information on themes and meanings, and also ritual objects, such as a handbell, a giant rosary donated by devotees, and an altar set sent by the renowned scholar Japanologist Basil Hall Chamberlain on the towards the bottom left there, with a rare incense seal. I've inset a detail of it there. And this is used to impress the form of a sacred Sanskrit character into the bed of ash, which is then filled with incense, and it sends up a prayer in the form of this character. So very specific, fascinating objects that Frank's acquired, and he understood their purpose. The most significant addition to the Japanese collection, perhaps in its entire history, came on the 12th of December 1881, with the purchase of the collection of 3,300 paintings from William Anderson. This remarkable assemblage was the fruit of 7 years' residence in Japan and remains the strongest and largest in Europe, and one of the best outside Japan. Anderson was a surgeon in Her Majesty's Navy and lived in Tokyo from 1873 to 1880. Being on the ground as temple and daimyo collections were dispersed, he had a unique opportunity to build a substantial and rich collection, and was unfettered by the biases of some of his expatriate peers. He possessed deep respect for Japanese art, but took a typically scientific approach, aiming to build a comprehensive representation of all periods and schools. Here you see examples by Kano Yukinobu of the bird and flower genre at left, a copy of Sue's long landscape hand scroll, by the 15-year-old Kano Seisen in Osanobu, the top in the center, and one from the splendid pair of folding screens showing the Tsushima Festival, soon to be on display in the gallery. And in 1879, the Asiatic Society of Japan staged an exhibition of works from the Anderson collection, which apparently was a spur for the American Ernest Fenollosa to develop his interest in this field. And he became a towering figure subsequently. Princess Akiko of Mikasa has studied the collecting activities of Franks and Anderson for her doctoral thesis, and she describes how Anderson pioneered a perception of Japan's pictorial production as art. And he compiled the first comprehensive history, The Pictorial Arts of Japan, in 1886, which was later translated into Japanese. On his return to London, Anderson offered the collection to the museum, and Franks wrote a letter in support of the purchase, stating, "I have for some years paid attention to this class of art and have never seen any specimens to compare with some of those in the collection. Dr. Anderson had exceptional opportunities of obtaining specimens, and he has evidently bestowed much pains and time on the formation of the collection. It's probable that he has formed the most select and valuable series that has been brought to Europe." Anderson was retained to document the collection, with no one else possessing anything like his knowledge, and the descriptive and historical catalogue of 1886 contains a wealth of information on artists and subjects. And he organized Japanese painting into 7 schools: Buddhist, Kano, and we've seen those examples, Yamato and Sesshu, the third, Yamato Tosa, and Popular and Shijo. So here you see a richly colored court scene by Sumiyoshi Hirotsura, typical of the broad Tosa school at left. Next to it, an opulently attired courtesan by Utagawa Kuniaki of the Popular, or Ukiyo-e school. A landscape of the Chinese school is next, with geometrically distorted towering mountains by the little-known Tosaka Buntai, and a lyrical collaborative Shijo work bringing together Matsumura Keibun for the geese and Shibata Gito for the moon. And there are many works and many examples of this interesting collaborative practice in the Anderson collection. Some works were of recent production, such as this masterly trompe-l'oeil by Shibata Zeshin, where the demons escaping Junquei's grasp actually burst out of the mount, or the delicately feathered peafowl by Oguchi Unkin, an artist briefly patronized by Fenollosa, but then set aside. Many works like this one are unmounted, suggesting that Anderson acquired them straight from the painter's studio. Another strength is the large number of drawings and preparatory sketches, providing rich insights into the artist's working practice, such as the studies of birds by Noda Tomin. And we have two examples here from a much larger group. And the collection still yields surprises as we advance its online cataloguing. Just last week, I realized that the signature on this beautiful rendering of 3 types of cherry tree at right is kosetsu. And this was the physician and teacher, a little detail there to show you the delicate rendering. This was the teacher of the painter whom I studied for my doctoral dissertation. The most spectacular painting in the Anderson collection is the scene of the legendary hero Minamoto no Tametomo, the legendary bowsman Tametomo, challenging the inhabitants of Demon Island to test his strength. So you see them tugging on his bow. As well as being a masterpiece by Hokusai, it is an important documentary work dated to 1811 in the inscription, commemorating the highly profitable completion of the serialized novel Shinsetsu Yumi Harizuki by Kyokute Bakin, famous novelist of the time, with illustrations by Hokusai. And the inscription tells us that this painting was commissioned by the publisher, as the novel had been such a success. We have this lavish, extravagant, large work to celebrate the completion and the profits made. Anderson's collection was exhibited in 1888, providing an early opportunity for people to experience a previously unknown area of art. And his aim of a global collection makes it particularly valuable, as there are hundreds of examples by little-known artists, provoking sustained interest from Japanese researchers to the present day, such as this piece by Nansen, otherwise unknown. You can explore the Anderson collection and much more via the collection's database. And the photographs for this and many other works were generously created by the Art Research Center of Ritsumeikan University. Not only are there multiple detail images, such as this one, but there is also a seamless zoom function that takes you right into the work. So I hope that gives you an idea of how close up you can examine these works. And we're really excited by the thought that this is possible from anywhere in the world, anyone at any time. And I have sat in my hotel room in Japan, browsing the collection, thinking about works that I need to talk to people about. So always there at your fingertips. 6 years later, the collection developed in a new direction with a group of 1,160 archaeological items assembled by William Gowland, and then purchased and donated by Franks. Gowland was a metallurgist, hired as a foreign advisor to the Japanese government, an oyatoi gaikokujin, and working at the Imperial Japanese Mint in Osaka from 1872 to 1888. His long residence in Japan allowed him to develop his interest in archaeology, and he was able to investigate more than 406 mounded tombs of the Kofun period, that's the 3rd to 7th centuries AD, and 130 of these tombs in detail. And many of these tombs, these sites, are today under the jurisdiction of the agency of the imperial household and are no longer accessible. And you see a selection on the screen here of the ceramics, which form a large part of the collection, the metalwork that he was particularly interested in, as well as stone tools and metal implements that he excavated, sometimes purchased. Some of these pieces are currently on display in Stonehenge at their visitor center, in a special display on stone circles in Japan. So if you have a chance to go there, it's a very interesting display. The Japanese print collection received a significant boost in 1906 when the collection of about 1,850 works was purchased from the novelist Arthur Morrison. Though little known today, Morrison was very successful in his time, writing socialist realist fiction about the slums of East London, with themes of the endemic poverty, crime, and violence, and doing much work to draw attention to the problems there to the greater audience of his novels. His collection ranges from the beginnings of print production in the 1600s right through to the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, and includes some of the museum's finest works and masterpieces by Hokusai and Hiroshige, as you see on the screen here. And the acquisition of the Morrison collection laid the ground for subsequent gifts, especially those of R.N. Shaw and the couple Charles Ricketts and Charles Shannon. And Edo period prints in the collection now number about 10,000 works. So it's really key when these single collections come in from an individual who is interested in placing the collection in the museum, and it becomes the seed or the foundation on which more can be built. Morrison was also a serious collector of Japanese paintings, and in 1911 he published the fruits of his study as The Painters of Japan, described by the curator Lawrence Binyon as thorough, lucid, and competent. Morrison never visited Japan, but in the book's preface he singles out Harold Parlett, His Majesty's consul in Dairen, who had also spent time in Tokyo. And he thanks him for his unselfish aid extended over many years of his long residence in Japan in the acquisition of many of my best pictures. 7 years later, Morrison was in need of a sports car, and he sold his collection of 622 Japanese paintings to Sir William Gwyn Evans on the condition that it be donated to the museum, and the donor was duly ennobled as baronet. We have this splendid photograph of Morrison at home, with a wonderfully sensitive work by Hokusai of a seller of fortune-telling poems hanging on the wall at left. And there's an amusing recollection of Morrison's collecting passion in the memoir of the poet William Ernest Henley. Mr. Arthur Morrison likewise found Henley a kindred spirit in his taste for Japanese prints, and when he found a new choice specimen in some dingy marine store in Wapping or Limehouse, he would return so agog with his discovery that the Henley household would be roused from their slumbers to rejoice with him, even though it was past midnight. The collection has early significant works, such as the broken ink landscape in the style of Sesshu that you see here, and on the right, Sugawara no Michizane crossing to China, which was recently fully mounted with the support of Sumitomo Foundation. And Morrison donated further works, screen paintings, and then bequeathed paintings alongside prints and ceramics. So he was a huge contributor to the collection. He was not on the ground in Japan, and there is an incidence of problematic works, but the collection still yields a rich range and many strong examples, including 3 of the museum's 6 genuine Hokusai paintings. The collection is comparable in range to Anderson's, but it's particularly strong in ukiyo-e, this popular style, the floating world style, such as these works by Utagawa Toyoharu on the left, then Yashima Gakute, Kubo Shunman, and Utagawa Toyokuni. And as slides are never adequate to convey the delicacy of the original work, the pigments on silk, I show you here a detail of the actor Sagawa Rokko IV in the role of Shizuka Gozen. So this is one of the female role specialist actors, the onagata, performing a dance role. And then 4 sketchbooks by Hiroshige that you see in the top right corner, an example of, are a particularly significant item often being requested for exhibitions in Japan. And like the Anderson collection, the Morrison collection was displayed a year after its acquisition. And within all of this, the person we must credit for the phenomenal growth of the Japanese pictorial art collection is the curator Lawrence Binyon, who would join the museum in 1893. 20 years later, the Sub-Department of Oriental Prints and Drawings was created in recognition of his abilities. Binyon was a poet and resented how curatorial duties depleted his time for writing, and this is fortunately a problem I do not share. His poem For the Fallen is renowned and very widely known, and a verse from it is inscribed on the war memorial at the front of the museum. The distinctive watercolor portrait by Edmund Dulac effectively conveys Binyon's character, I think, and was inspired by a shiraku print that Binyon had brought into the collection. The next major addition to the Japanese collection I'd like to highlight is that of Robert Wiley Lloyd. He's remembered primarily for his generous bequest of a group of 64 superlative watercolors by J.M.W. Turner and a collection of Swiss prints. But he also collected Japanese swords and Chinese lacquer, which he bequeathed to the museum. Born in 1868 in Lancashire, Wiley was a successful businessman with a passion for collecting. He drove a hard bargain and was described as having a dour strain and a vein of ruthlessness in his character. But he also gave financial support to young men at university and sponsored mountaineering expeditions. He was a keen alpinist, participating in 50 annual seasons, and lived to 90. The obituary in the Alpine Journal tactfully stated that he aroused varied feelings among those brought into contact with him. And Lloyd's collections were on display in his rooms at the Albany on Piccadilly. Frustratingly, we have no information on where he made his purchases, but the blades date from the medieval period through to the 19th century, with a fine selection of the koshirae, the mounts, that can be switched in and out for these blades. So this is a very strong group and places us in a good position for representation of this very significant craft working tradition in Japan. You may not think of the British Museum as having Japanese books, but it is especially rich in this area, largely thanks to the collecting efforts of Jack Hillier. From the 1680s onwards, ukiyo-e artists were typically active in producing designs for illustrated books, or ehon, as seen in the upper row here. But similarly, artists in other schools issued painting manuals to promote their particular style or brand. There are wonderful examples from the Maruyama Shijo school in Hillier's collection, such as Sokken that you see second from the left on the bottom here, of a greeting going on between two men. And by Bumpo, a painting exhibition being hung at the second from right at the bottom. And then many examples of works by Hokusai, and this is an adaptation, Ehon Suikoden, the Tales of the Water Margin, adaptation of a Chinese story. Hillier developed a passion for Japanese printed media, which led him to work for Christie's, where he catalogued many highly significant collections in the 1970s and 80s. And in 1979, he sold his collection of around 500 titles. So that's titles, not volumes. There are many, many more volumes, distinguished by the superlative quality of the impressions, so the crispness, the freshness of the impressions. And this edition instantly upgraded the museum's representation of this important area, with painting manuals, poetry anthologies, gazetteers, serialized novels, and among others. And all have been photographed by the Art Research Centre I mentioned before and can be browsed online. I'm very conscious that this talk so far has been entirely about male collectors, as they were the ones with the agency to acquire, the physical freedom to travel to Japan or simply to continental dealers, and most importantly, the financial means to purchase. Franks in the 19th century had donated more than 1,200 netsuke toggles, and there had been further gifts of both netsuke and inro, the lacquer containers worn by men. But once again, a single, indefatigable, and now female collector transformed our holdings in the person of Anne Hull Grundy. And between 1978 and 1982, she donated 760 items. Hull Grundy was born in 1926 in Nuremberg into a Jewish banking and manufacturing family who resettled in England when the Nazis took power in 1933. Her father established the pressed metal business Metoy in Northampton, which became a household name as the producer of corgi cars. It was profit from these toys, together with income from the family bank, that enabled her to create one of the greatest post-war collections of 19th century jewelry, as well as Japanese works. Hull Grundy was a redoubtable individual who took to her bed for many years and made the world, and particularly its art dealers, come to her. And the little skeleton at bottom left is having its second outing at Japan House, having been singled out by Rosemary Bandini in her talk back in November. But he is a very endearing little fellow with his hands pressed together piously in prayer. There's a common misperception that the British Museum collects only antiquities, and indeed the departments were named that way until just 20 years ago. In reality, the museum has always collected the contemporary. And during the 1980s and 90s, the head of the Japanese department, Lawrence Smith, made multiple visits to kilns across Japan, building up the representation of modern ceramic practice. And then in 2002, through the efforts of his colleague Victor Harris, the museum benefited from the generosity of Saga Prefecture, which organized an exhibition of 63 recent works, which were subsequently donated. These were chosen to demonstrate the breadth of activity in the prefecture, known for its porcelain production over the past 400 years. And many of the artists have gone on to establish an international reputation. The last individual I highlight made his donation in 2008. Arthur R. Miller is Professor Emeritus at Harvard University, described as one of America's most distinguished legal scholars in the areas of civil litigation, copyright, and privacy, and a renowned commentator on the law and society. For several decades, Miller built up a definitive collection of 1,800 works by Utagawa Kuniyoshi, one of the major print artists of the 19th century, which he generously donated via the American Friends of the British Museum. The gift was celebrated with a special exhibition at the Royal Academy in 2009, which many of you may remember. The Miller collection demonstrates Kuniyoshi's astounding range of subjects and compositional approaches, and it's strong in Kuniyoshi's speciality of warrior prints, as seen in the examples here, such as the ghosts of the Taira warriors attacking Minamoto no Yoshitsune's ship in the bottom right. But the Miller collection is also rich in all of Kuniyoshi's genres, including kabuki actors, which you see at top left there, and bottom left a splendid triptych scene. Poetry, 2 examples from the Hyakunin issue, 100 Poets, 1 Poem Each series at bottom right, and beauties, a very popular genre in the mid-19th century. Beauties and their cats, which Kuniyoshi cared for deeply. And to complete this portrait of the collection, I introduce a few recent purchases, generously supported by individual donors, the Art Fund, and JTI. Back in 2019, Timothy Clark retired after 32 years at the British Museum, and under his energetic and sage curatorship, the holdings of pictorial art grew remarkably. This sumptuous gold leaf screen of a mother tiger transporting her 3 cubs across the billowing stream was the first full-size example in this format by the major 18th century painter Maruyama Okyo, who developed a distinctive lyrical style of nature representation grounded in sketching from life, which became the foundation of an extensive network of pupils and sub-schools. The subject is a Chinese riddle. One cub on the left is aggressive, the naughty cub, and he cannot be left alone with his siblings. So how does the mum manage to get them all safely across? And you can tell me at the end of the lecture, or we'll have it in the Q&A. The rendering of the dripping wet fur is beautifully delicate, with the rich mineral pigments contrasting with the sparkling gold. And like Kuniyoshi, we can assume that Okyo had cats to serve as his models rather than real tigers, which were not known in Japan. The museum already had 2 impressions of the most famous Japanese print ever, and one of the most recognizable images in the world, the so-called Great Wave. But these were lacking somewhat in quality, and in 2008 we acquired a superb impression, which has been much in demand ever since. This is an early state of a design that continued to be printed for years and years. So the lines we see in this impression are crisp, the pigment is well preserved, and most notably, the delicate salmon pink of the clouds at the top has not faded. So all of those elements would have been there, including the clouds, but you can tell the quality of a Great Wave print by these aspects, the lines, the quality of the color, the preservation of those clouds. The appearance of a genuine work by Utamaro, seen at right, at a local auction in England was a rare occurrence, which Tim Clark seized on, providing only the museum's second painting, by this master. And just last month, I acquired this remarkable painting in silk, presenting 9 generations of the Ichikawa Danjiro acting lineage, with a box inscription by Danjiro IX himself, and seems it was part of his efforts to rehabilitate and remake kabuki theatre for the modern era in the late 19th century. and this painting will be on display from April. The activities of Nicole Coolidge-Romanier as curator in her 9 years at the museum were key in building up studio arts. In the galleries, we draw attention to the fact that these pieces are made by living artists by including their photographs in the labels. Onishi Isao creates hoop-built trays, magewa, covered in flawless lacquer, and he was made the holder of an intangible cultural property, known as a living national treasure, in 2002. Imaizumi Imayamon XIV succeeded his father as head of the workshop and also as living national treasure. He created this piece to mark 400 years of porcelain production in Arita. It features flowers of the 4 seasons in his signature technique of usuzumi, thin ink, but using depleted uranium as the pigment. And it also incorporates the stencil resist approach of yuzen textile dyeing. So a truly innovative work. And pieces by 2 younger female artists, both based in the UK, invite surprise from our visitors. Hosono Hitomi studied in Kanazawa, Copenhagen, and London, and then spent time at Wedgwood's factory, from where she took inspiration to create sprig-molded leaves modeled on those in her own garden, and 1,000 of which cover this vessel. Placed in the gallery, it presents powerful residences with the ornately decorated prehistoric flame pots nearby. And Mori Junko takes hard metal and transmutes it into supple organic forms such as petals, leaves, and pine cones. Mori took thousands of forged steel nails and hammered them into this form, depending on the contingency of the manual process to determine the final outcome. She created Ring of Small Petals from her Propagation Project series as a memorial for those who died in the Great East Japan disaster of March 2011. Since 1990, the museum has offered to the public a suite of galleries for Japanese material on the top floor of the King Edward VII building at the north of the site. They are now named the Mitsubishi Corporation Japanese Galleries, acknowledging the generous sponsorship which has been in place since 2008. Many items of Japanese art are light sensitive, so we change all pictorial art twice a year, in April and October, and also textiles and lacquer every few years. And I'll touch only briefly on this display as I encourage you to visit and explore the galleries for yourself. They trace the history and culture of Japan from ancient prehistory to the present day, drawing on the historical collections and making interventions of contemporary material to draw out continuities, as we've seen. Ancient Japan explores the transmission of technologies of ceramics and metalworking from the Asian continent to Japan, and medieval Japan presents sculptures and paintings from the various strands of Buddhism and other faiths. Edo Japan looks at the luxury objects, paintings, and prints enjoyed by the various classes of samurai, court, and townspeople, including the iconic suit of armor that was purchased just a few years ago. And it also challenges the misperception that Japan was a closed country by considering the 4 gateways of Tsushima, Kagoshima, Nagasaki, and Hakodate that brought in people, objects, and ideas to mainland Japan. And modern Japan is structured on 4 themes of nation building and empire, city and countryside, freeing the self, and living national treasures. So closing down or zooming in from the nation level to the regional level to the individual. As you can see from this image, over the years, there's been a very active program of special exhibitions from the Japan curatorial team. These tackled new themes and approaches taken from Japanese scholarship, such as the concept of kazari in 2004, and introduced audiences to contemporary artists working in traditional media with Crafting Beauty in 2007. The groundbreaking Shunga exhibition of 2013 contributed to a shift of attitudes towards this material within Japan itself, where it traveled to 2 venues. And to explain again that Shunga is erotic art, sex and pleasure, it was titled. And then Hokusai Beyond the Great Wave of 2017 was a sellout exhibition, demonstrating the abiding appeal of this world-famous artist. And we have plenty of activity planned for the years ahead. Next year, we'll see a special installation in the Japanese galleries on cultural salons in Kyoto and Osaka between 1780 and 1880. This is one outcome from a 3-year research project entitled Creative Collaborations, led by my colleague Akiko Yano and funded by UKRI and the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. A project to study the groups engaged in cultural activities, poetry, art, music, tea, painting, which were composed of serious but amateur practitioners from all walks of life, young and old, women and men. The display will draw on the large number of paintings by the Maruyama Shijo school, which was characteristic of the region, and on the group of about 3,000 surimono, or luxury privately printed prints from this region, from Osaka and Kyoto, and books from the Hillier collection that you've already seen, folding fans, and other items. Then in 2025, my colleague Alfred Haft will curate the special exhibition Hiroshige, Artist of the Open Road, examining the development of this artist's novel approach to landscape representation, as well as his precursors and those after, inspired by him, both within Japan and elsewhere. We have 3 works by Hiroshige here, and then very close composition by Ohara Koson from the early 20th century. And I will be working for the next few years on a major exhibition for 2026 on the myths and reality of the samurai. Samurai is one of the best known cultural icons in the world, perhaps unique in its global intelligibility, but the long history of representation of Japanese warriors has led to widely held misperceptions. The exhibition, again based on a research project, will be the first to consider both the figure of the samurai in historical context and the wider cultural reach of samurai representation and appropriation from the medieval period right through to the present day, both in Japan and overseas. This will not focus on samurai kit, though that will be in there, but rather encompass paintings, documents, woodblock prints and books, alongside photography, movies, TV dramas, manga, anime, video games, and contemporary art, if I can fit all of that in. You may recognize some characters on that screen. So to close, I'd like to introduce some objects relating to the current special exhibition here at Japan House London, the Carpenter's Line, Woodworking Heritage in Hida Takayama. A pair of hand scrolls by the early ukiyo-e master Hishikawa Moronobu in our collection provides a valuable index of occupations of his time, the late 17th century, including this scene of carpenters sawing timber and chiseling. And when we zoom in, we see measuring the plank with a carpenter's line. Other paintings and prints show similar scenes of men at work. Just zoom in on this one at the right so you can see another chiseling activity there. And also the ritual prayers made for success in work, with this image by Zeshin at bottom left of a carpenter's tools placed on an altar. And when discussing woodworking in Hida, an essential book to consider is The Story of the Craftsman of Hida Province, Hida no Takumi Monogatari, published in 6 volumes in 1808. This was a fantastical story, similar to a fairy tale, and a classic example of the Gokan genre, the serialized novel, which was tremendously popular in Japan. It tells of a master craftsman who creates ingenious devices, such as mechanical animals and portable bridges, that help him thwart his enemies. The story was written by Rokujuen and illustrated by Hokusai. Rokujuen was the pen name of Ishikawa Masamochi, a prolific cultural figure. He was born the son of an ukiyo-e artist. He became a well-known author of popular literature and a poet of kyoka, or crazy verse, and he also ran an inn, hence another of his pen names, Yadoya no Meshimori. In the first image in the story, we see the protagonist Inabe no Suminawa, named for the carpenter's line, the Suminawa, who has just finished creating a fantastical wooden crane. And his tools are clearly foregrounded with another carpenter's line. He is one of the highly skilled Hida craftsmen who were sent to the capital in lieu of taxes to work on constructing buildings there. And we see at right the arrival of a group of these men at the palace. Suminawa journeys to Mount Horai, the mountain of the immortals, where he receives tuition to hone his already considerable skills. He encounters a young couple, Yamabito and Princess Nyoichi, who are not permitted to marry and are cast out of the enchanted land. And at top left, you see one of the ill-fated pair experiencing the fall. After many journeys and challenges, Suminawa helps unite the star-crossed lovers by means of his ingenious devices, such as a wooden horse that gallops of its own power at top right. At bottom left is one of the moments of high tension when our hero Yamabito and Suminawa's trusty sidekick Matsumitsu have been captured by the evil villain and beaten mercilessly, accused of murdering Yamabito's mother. However, the severed head is suddenly revealed to be an astonishingly lifelike creation by Suminawa, and they have been framed. And then, lest we forget, the best stories are driven by love. We have a scene at night of Yamabito stealing into the princess's chamber, where he is espied by the knight chaplain and taken into captivity. Yamabito is a mere groundsman, but the princess knows in her heart that so comely a youth cannot be other than the man glimpsed in her supernaturally charged dream. A whole age seemed to lie between them, but surely some mysterious bond connected them. Their hearts were spontaneously attracted by a mutual inclination. And that's from the translation published by Frederick Victor Dickens in 1912, which is lively and entertaining, and I encourage you to read it. And it includes all of Hokusai's illustrations. And I'd also recommend a recent blog on the British Library's site by Yasuka Otsuka about the book. The frontispiece of the novel shows the carpenter's line, and we have 4 examples in the museum, ranging from the purely functional at top left, through whimsical in the form of a rat at top right, to ceremonial with jet black lacquer and gold decoration in the bottom 2. The first object I was ever shown in the British Museum, as a green and naive master's student while at SOAS, demonstrates the use of the Suminawa line outside woodworking. The grid on this large preparatory drawing of a peacock and peahen was created by snapping the line coated in red pigment, as you can just see in this detail. And this grid helped the artist transfer the design to silk. The work is by Takikate, highly successful painter of the late 19th century, whom I went on to study for my doctoral dissertation. In-row containers employed extensive use of wood being formed on a thin wooden core and typically coated with opaque lacquer. However, some were carved from a single block of wood, requiring tremendous skill and precision. And the in-row at left features a roaring dragon racing over roiling waves with flames rising around its head, and its body wraps around the in-row. Other pieces take advantage of the natural beauty of wood grain, given a rich luster through the application of clear lacquer, such as this example by Zeshin, with turtles in gold and black lacquer applied on top. And the common materials for the netsuke toggles were wood and ivory, with the former being more affordable, so we have many examples. The head of Nitta Yoshisada seems to allude to the alarmingly lifelike heads described in the tale of the Hida craftsman. Yoshisada was a warrior lord in the early 1300s, during the period of rival imperial courts. The subject reminds us of the gruesome confiscating of enemies' heads, which was standard battlefield practice during Japan's protracted civil wars. And the chestnut in the center is one of my favorite pieces, something you would love to have in your pocket to keep your fingers busy in idle moments. It demonstrates well the principle of utsushi, using one material to imitate another. That's often found in Japanese art. And the snail on the tub is remarkable in its evocation of the dappled, slimy texture of the mollusk. The carved Naito Toyomasa, whose examples you see in the lower register there, he showed particular skill in wood, working for the daimyo of Shinoyama Castle, just northwest of Osaka. On the left is the lesser-known story of the Taoist immortal Hu Gong, Koko Sennin, who lived in China in the 3rd century and slept at night in a ceramic pot. And other fine examples include the gourd at top left with the delicately carved net on its surface, and pieces by the Iwami school, a lineage of artists working on the north coast of today's Shimane prefecture. The snail at left being by its founder, Shimizu Iwao, and then the snail on a leaf by his pupil. And the minuscule inscription on this piece shows a sense of humor, with the conceit that the leaf has been nibbled away after the inscription was made. You can see in that little gap there. 2 recent acquisitions show how contemporary artists keep the art of working with wood alive. Osaka Hiromichi created this incense container from sappan wood and black persimmon wood in the shape of a flower, with delicate inlay in metal of treasure flower motifs, the hosoge, on the lid and foliage of the rim. Osaka was commissioned in 1980 by the Imperial Household Agency to create a replica of an object in the Shosoin Imperial Repository within Todaiji Temple, and he drew on his study of pieces in the Shosoin to revive techniques of woodcraft and metal inlay, and he was designated a living national treasure. The younger artist Suda Kenji made this small chest of maple wood currently on display, named Stila Forest in Winter, in 2013. It's hinged, 2 sections hinged together, with 5 drawers of different sizes. And the maple wood retains its natural appearance on the drawers, but it's covered on the exterior with lacquer sprinkled with gold powder. And the drawer fronts have a vertical strip of inlaid mother of pearl decoration and small discs of the same material punctuating the exterior lower edge. And then my final work this evening will be the subject of the Asahi Shimbun display in room 3, just inside the museum's front doors, from April 20th. It is a model of a festival float measuring 120 centimeters wide, which sits on an accompanying wheeled carriage. It had waited patiently in storage for many years, and I spotted it during the quiet times of the pandemic, labeled as a Chinese junk, but I began to suspect otherwise. An inspection of the banners with their triple aoi, triple hollyhock crest, confirmed to me immediately that it was indeed Japanese. The boat was donated by the antiques trading firm Yamanaka & Co., which had opened a branch at 68 New Bond Street in the early 1900s. And they made this donation to mark the Summer Olympics of 1908 being held in London. And you can see here aspects which have become apparent during conservation of the model, the boat. The firm's label at top left, and then another label in the second from the left at the bottom, indicating that it was being dispatched to London. Thanks to research by Kuchiki Yuriko just last month, we now think we know its maker, a craftsman from Komatsu in Ishikawa Prefecture named Murakami Tetsudo, best known for elaborate sculptures on mythological subjects on shrines and festival floats. And Tetsudo was brought by Yamanaka to open a factory in Osaka producing hybrid Western-style furniture with ornately sculpted decoration for export to Europe and North America. The form of the boat, we have discovered, is the gozabune, or the state barge, the craft used to transport high-ranking figures such as daimyo or members of the imperial family during the Edo period. And Tetsudo has modeled this into a hikiyama, the wheeled float customarily used in Japanese festivals. So the display will explore all these aspects and present the boat fully conserved, on display for the first time in well over 100 years. And preparing the exhibition is my work for the next couple of months. I hope this overview of the collection through its history will encourage you to visit, to browse the online database, and even to request objects for viewing in the Asia Students' Room. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Rosina, for a fascinating and in-depth talk. We do have a few minutes, maybe just for a couple of questions. I have one online already, so thank you, if I may.
The tigers, has anyone worked out the tigers?
Not about tigers, I'm afraid. This one is about the Ainu artifacts in the collection. Could you talk to us a little bit more about what you have in the collection related to Ainu?
Immediately a question about pieces I left out. But there were so many that I had to leave out, having decided to structure it on the shape of its formation. We have 200 and something, I can't remember, I'd say about 250 Ainu objects, and the majority of them came in at the time of the 1910 Japan-British exhibition, because there was an Ainu village as part of the exhibition. So it's a very interesting group that has received attention from scholars from Japan in the past. There's also a small group of material that came from John Anderson, who gave us archaeological pieces as well, that came in the 1880s, but it's primarily that group from 1910. And they have a range of types of object, household items, cooking utensils that were used in daily life in Hokkaido, but also textiles and jewelry. There are some paintings which perhaps can't be classified as Ainu artifacts because they're usually by mainland Japanese traveling into Hokkaido, representing Ainu life and custom. And then also contemporary pieces. So particularly by Kaizawa Toru, we have a sculpture representing the rebirth or reinvigoration of Ainu identity in recent years. So I encourage you to go and look at that. But it's one of the windows, the gateways to the world that I showed in the gallery display.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do we have any questions maybe here? We do. We have a question just here. If you could wait for a microphone so that the people online can also hear you. Thank you.
Thank you. Could you please tell us briefly how you decide which object to put on display in the gallery? Thank you.
Usually there's a theme, a small theme that runs through the displays. So if you visit at the moment, there's a theme of the romance of the three kingdoms. So Chinese culture being tremendously important in the construction of Japanese art and themes within Japanese pictorial art. The Romance of the Three Kingdoms is a very widely known Chinese epic tale that was drawn on extensively in Japanese painting and prints. So we have a number of paintings, prints, books that all tie together through that theme. There's another theme on the actor Ichikawa Danjiro IX. So there are woodblock prints. There will be a painting coming up on Danjiro IX and a photograph of him as well, because he lived into the era of photography. So it's by choosing themes like that that we make the selection of works. And I should credit my colleague Alfred Haff, because he takes a lot of the responsibility. He does most of the work in selecting the objects. There are also seasonal ways of directing the choice. So we try to choose pieces that match with the seasons. It's a 6-month period for the rotations. So that takes us through from October to April, and then April to October. So at the moment we have snow, and then festivals are a good theme in the summer. So these kind of structuring devices that we use. For the medieval section, it's been interesting in recent months that my colleague Akiko Yano has been exploring the Buddhist painting collection and trying to bring out pieces that haven't been displayed in recent years. We also have a conservation program that tends to take several years to complete work on a single piece. So there's a forward plan for when that piece is going to go out, which will allow us to show works previously not seen. But new acquisitions we also like to foreground, so there's always a good opportunity to put those on display.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. We have maybe a question at the back, I see. If you could please put your hand up so that you could receive the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you for a very informative and interesting talk. And I've got a question about the potential ethical issues surrounding the act of collecting in the past. So as you know, the British Museum have some issues in the way they acquired objects in the past, such as looting, or the way that is considered unethical from our perspective. But how about the collecting of Japanese objects? Are there any objects that have such issues?
The simple answer is no. There are no contested objects within the collection that have those complex associations with them. I think there's a more straightforward context to how the objects were acquired for the Japanese collection, which is usually on the art market. That can have its issues in itself, but setting aside Sloane, who's a much earlier period of the 1690s, and there's only maybe 10, 15 objects from Japan from him. The majority of the collecting that I have shown this evening has been from the late 19th century. So we have to take into consideration the historical background of what's happening in Japan. So I mentioned the Edo period, which goes up until 1868, and then we have the regime change with the introduction of a new government, establishment of a constitutional monarchy in the late 19th century. And this expands an already extant art market, but the social disruption, and I alluded to this, or I touched on it briefly with Anderson, the dispersal of these large collections that had belonged to high status individuals, high status families, that floods the market with material. So the collectors in the late 19th century are taking advantage of the changing social situation in Japan. So most of the material is coming in through that. And the supply to the art market continues through the 20th century. And the collectors that I mentioned have been purchasing their works in that manner. There's also a lot of new creations within the Japanese collection. That's partly why I wanted to show or focus on, draw attention to the Saga prefecture ceramics, because many of these objects, right through from the early 20th century to the present day, are being created by the artists. So I had to do a due diligence form today for a purchase an acquisition that I'm proposing. And it was made 4 months ago. So it's a brand new object. And this is very often the case, that we're demonstrating contemporary activity within Japanese art.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm very conscious of the time, because until 8 o'clock tonight, you're able to see the exhibition on the other side. And I know that Rosina has very kindly talked about Suminawa, the carpenter's line, and also the Hida no Takumi no Monogatari, which we also have on display. So I would encourage people to visit that if they can. We have also, just to say, online, 2 people, thanks to Elizabeth and Grace, have been very keen about your tigers. Is this right? The tigers. While the mother takes the naughty one across, then brings across the one cub, swaps the bad one back, and then brings across another cub, and then the naughty one again.
That is correct.
So
multiple journeys have to be made so that one is never left alone with the aggressive one.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. Would you please join me in thanking Dr. Rosina Buckland, Curator of Japanese Collections at the British Museum. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you also to our event partners, the Royal Collection Trust. Thank you to everybody here in Japan House, and also those who have participated online. If you'd like to listen to today's talk again, you will be able to see it and listen to it on our social media platforms. And following the event, we will also send you an event feedback form. And if you do fill that in, it will help us to continue these things in the future. We have a couple of events coming up. Now we have, of course, the exhibition. Please do go and have a look if you have time this evening, or come back. It's the last week. We close the exhibition on the 29th of this month. We also start our film screening series looking at the works of Ozu Yasujiro, probably one of Japan's, if not the world's, most loved directors. We will also continue our work with the Royal Collection Trust with an Ikebana demonstration and display on Thursday, the 26th of January at the Queen's Gallery. We have a talk, Diplomatic and Royal Gifts from Japan, on the 2nd of February at the Queen's Gallery. And also a talk about Nabe Shimaware on Monday, the 6th of February at the Queen's Gallery. We have plenty more coming up. We have a brand new exhibition starting next month, all about kumihimo, the braiding from Japan. Please do come and visit us again for that. Once again, thank you very much to Dr. Rosina Buckland. Thank you.